Welcome back. Today we will be looking at Romans 9:30 through 10:13. To get background on this, it'd be good to kind of maybe go back and read all of chapter 9 and go up to 10:13 so you can kind of see the flow of Paul's argument. So if you need a chance to pause and do that right now. And welcome back. So what we're going to look at is one of these sort of for Paul, he's like ramping up to the end of his main argument, which is in chapter 11. He's kind of getting all the scenarios set up, and then I think in chapter 11 is like his conclusion paragraph, and then the rest of Romans is like applications. And this is sort of like getting all the dots connected is what's happening into chapter 9 through chapter 10. So let's kind of dig in, and we're going to kind of see some fairly familiar kind of verses and stuff if you've grown up in church and stuff like that. So in 9:30 it says, "What shall we say then? That Gentiles," you see that question mark kind of marks off a transition argument, hence why this is probably the proper starting place for this section. That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. So Gentiles, he's saying they weren't even looking for God, whereas a lot of the Jewish people were working really hard, but Gentiles found it without looking for it. And that's a picture of God's grace, his sovereign choice, that he happened to do that, which is a lot of what he's marveling at in chapter 9, which is sometimes used to enter into big predestination arguments and stuff like that. In the context of Romans, he's trying to figure out these are Gentiles who didn't really deserve anything. He just kind of showed up at the right time, and now they're in the church. What's up with that? And what Paul's trying to say, that's the way God's working the entire Bible. That's the kind of God is. He's the kind of guy who, if you think the parables, where you have all the laborers that show up and work, uh, there's a parable where Jesus goes out and picks up people who are like kind of day laborers basically, and the first people he picks up, he's like, "Hey," the main character, the boss in the story, so he says, "Hey, come and work for me. I'll pay you a day's wage," and they bring him in. And then a few hours later, he goes and gets some more guys, and he says, "Come on, work. Why are you doing just lazing around?" And he keeps doing that until like just 2 hours before quitting time, he hires some more, and then he pays them reverse orders. Ones he hired last, he pays them a full day's wage. And he does that all the way down to the first workers. And you look at it as like that's really not fair. They worked a lot harder, but they paid them what he said he'd pay them. And that's sort of like if he decided to give more to others that they didn't deserve, that's his business. And that's kind of showing like a consistency in God's character here, that God's a God of grace. That God's a God is a lot more about getting things you don't deserve, to kind of understand how this all works. We get all pouty thinking God owes us something. If we think God owes us something, we're in the wrong mindset to get any of this. And that's kind of one of the things Paul's trying to reemphasize. God doesn't owe us. And so that's sort of the main point that we're supposed to get from chapter 9 going into this. All right, let's resume. Sorry. So what should we say then? The Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That is a righteousness that is by faith, by believing and trusting. But that Israel, the Jewish people, which he's still trying to figure out, who pursued the law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching the law. So they had the law, but they never got to actual righteousness. And again, he's saying the law is not bad. In fact, the law is good. It's from a good God, but the law is weak. And the law as a road to righteousness didn't get them over to it. Whereas God's righteousness actually comes instead by faith. So why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as if it were based on works. So he's not saying again the law is bad. What he's saying is they pursued it not on the basis of trusting God. On the whole, there's faith throughout the whole Old Testament, so do know that. But they didn't do that on the basis of that, but on the basis of like, if I do this, I can do it. So they're trusting in their own ability to fulfill it. Their faith is moved from God down to themselves. And that's going to be the problem with the faith versus works. Now, these verses inspire a whole lot of splits in the history of the Christian church, and maybe some like sort of bad faith arguments not to use a pun, against Jews sometimes too. That Jews is a works-based religion. It's a law-based religion. It's supposed to always be a faith-based religion using the law. Here, this has been used between Protestant and Catholics. It's central to the Reformation. It's like it's in the sort of big statements, the famous five solas of Luther. One of them is by faith alone, and the Catholics replied in the Council of Trent, nah, it's by faith and works. And you can see verses in James that kind of highlight that. I'm not sure. I kind of think maybe the way Luther framed it, where there's a little bit of genuine disagreement. Actually, there's a lot of genuine disagreement. There's also a little bit of talking past each other that Luther may have had an overstatement about exactly the relationship of faith and works. It's like you have to trust in just faith alone, but it's not antagonistic to works. It's antagonistic to trusting in works. The faith has to only be on God. And if it starts coming down to something that's like where you think God owes you something, you've done wrong. And because Luther's maybe overstatement, which he's marveling at a truth that had been maybe buried in the medieval church, the Catholic Church and the Council of Trent may have overreacted in the other direction, and we ended up talking past each other. Maybe that's the sort of assuming good intent on both sides kind of a way to look at this. So here it says because they pursued it as if it were by faith, but as if it were based on works. And since they stumbled, they thought the law, this good gift, became a stumbling block. It says it tripped them because they thought, oh, I can do this and do it. But the thing is, they couldn't do it, and so they're putting their faith in their own themselves, their ability to pull off the law, rather than in God and God's mercies and God's grace and God's providing. As it was written, behold, I am laying in Zion, a figurative statement for Jerusalem, a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. And that comes from Isaiah 28:16. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they will be saved. He's talking about his Jewish brothers. He's like he pray and sisters. He's praying for them that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. And that word zeal is kind of important. It's a big part of like Paul's own testimony. He claims in like when he does his autobiographical sketch where he just rants about everything he's done in his life in the book of Galatians, he talks about how much zeal he had. And zeal is a kind of loaded word in this time. There was a group called zealots that were around, and they took as their model this character from the Old Testament, from the book of Numbers, which a lot of people don't get to today. Book of Numbers has a story of Phineas, who is Moses' grandnephew, who is Aaron, the first high priest's grandson. And it was in this big temptation in Israel where they stumbled yet again when they're wandering around in the desert. And this was like their last big stumble for getting to the promised land. It was where they got tempted to intermarry with their idol worshiping neighbors on the advice of this prophet character, strange guy named Balaam. And they intermarried and they started worshiping other idols. And Phineas led a sort of like a crusade to basically eliminate these what polluting marriages, which polluting with idolatry, not by race, and slew them. Now, so zeal is like an intense word, and the zealots in Jesus' days are revolutionaries. In fact, they're the revolutionaries that eventually get Israel smacked down in AD 70 by Rome. That they're repeating rebellions. So he's like, I know they're dedicated, right? I know that they're not like slackers, and I have compassion there, but their zeal for God is misplaced. Their zeal was like a I can do this zeal and a pride kind of zeal. And he's saying the zeal has to be a zeal of gratitude for what God has done. They don't know what God has done. So here it says knowledge is a key thing. If you had zeal, your zeal would be with knowledge. And they said their zeal is without knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God, they don't know the actual righteousness of God. They assume a righteousness of God. And seeking to establish their own, by doing works of law, proving themselves that I did okay, which is what we tend to do ourselves all the time. We're always trying to live lives that prove we're okay. They did not submit to the actual God's righteousness. So when they ran into Jesus, when Jesus shows up, he is rejected because they don't recognize it because they're used to their righteousness, which pales in behalf of his. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. And that's a sort of kind of famous story, a famous verse. It's sort of almost it carries in some connotations that we don't get. We think end is like the finish is complete, but the Greek word there is telos. Telos is like it's not just the end; it's also like the purpose. It's like the goal. So it's yes, the law is a way to try to reach God is now obsolete, but it also means Christ was the purpose of the law. And if you think through like the Sermon on the Mount, where Christ says, "I came not to destroy the law, but to fulfill it," Paul and Jesus are kind of on the same page in this kind of statement, and that this is that the law was Christ's purpose. But if you keep doing it now, you're kind of like you're rejecting the actual God. And he keeps going in verse 5. For Moses writes about the righteousness as based on the law, that the person who does the commandment shall live by them. So if you want to do the commandments, you live it. But righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart who will ascend into heaven, that is to bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is to bring Christ to heaven. What does it say? The word is near in your mouth and your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Pause there, even though it's mid kind of sentence. What he's saying here is the living the command and saying, okay, am I doing this? Am I doing this? Am I doing this? Is a way of the old law and the way you do works. But now this new one is actually to say, is like, if I do this, I'm gonna be okay. Is this okay? Is this okay? And he's saying that's the wrong mindset. By the way, Christians are as guilty of this as anyone. It's like half your questions that you can get in a typical Bible class is going to be something along the lines as, hey, is this okay? Am I allowed to do this? Is it okay for Christians to do this? Is it okay to do this? Is like, is this going to keep me in heaven? Is this going to keep me from hell? I'm okay on this? And that's really, he's saying that's the wrong mindset. You're trusting in yourself's ability to follow a bunch of rules. When really, you need to be focused upon the word is near you in your mouth and your heart. You know what you're supposed to do in Christ. Christ is already near you. You probably already know the answer on whether you should be doing things or not. And really, this is where he gets into 10:9. This is like your kind of big Romans road passage of there. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and that means he's the Kyrios is huge. Kyrios, Kyrios means Lord. This is like that Jesus is God, but he's also in command, and that nothing else is in command. And with your and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead. So again, believe in the resurrection that Jesus beat death and therefore is like the real Messiah. You will be saved. And this is the sort of thing is like this is like you're not supposed to be worrying about does this get me there or does this get me there. It's like you're gonna get saved. Does that mean you don't want to do good things? No. If you see the truth that Jesus is commanding the universe, you kind of want to be on Team Jesus, and Jesus is for some things. He wants you to be the kind of person he is. Being Team Jesus doesn't mean like, yeah, I believe in that guy, and then you do your own thing. It's kind of living a life that is like his. So this isn't like your life is supposed to surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees, as Jesus says back in the Sermon on the Mount. So, for with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. They're saying it's supposed to be a public acknowledgement because it's supposed to be an advancement of the kingdom of God, and that confession's going to be mattering from here on out. Because if you remember way back in chapter 1, or way back in when we covered the background of Romans, when we get to the purpose of the end, he's like, I'm not ashamed to commit to say this is the truth. This is that Christ did this, that Christ rose from the dead, and that he has power to save. And this is why he does what he does. So The confession is like I have to like bring the world in line with the fact that Jesus is the actual Lord. So, for the scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. And that, if you think about it, is back where it all started in chapter 1. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. And here again, he's getting to like the payoff for the letter's application. That Jews and Greeks have no distinction, for the same Lord is Lord of all. That you don't have, God's not the God of Israel only, he's the God of the whole world. Jew and child is their God too. Bestowing riches on all who call on him. That God is generous, he's bringing everybody in. Jews were asked first, but he's bringing everybody in, and it's the same kind of end. For everyone who calls the name of the Lord will be saved. And again, he's saying everyone, Jew and Gentile, no distinction. And so the sort of arguments that he's anticipating in this church, and he's anticipating back in the church in Jerusalem when he goes there, are sort of irrelevant to him because everyone who calls is to be saved, Jew or Gentile. And we'll call it a day on this video now.